Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are today. I want to thank everyone for joining me in this breakout session where we're going to talk a little bit about vulnerability management and where you should spend your time. Just a quick introduction. My name's Troy Vennon. I am the Director of Security Innovation at Covail. Covail is a really interesting organization that we're based in Central Ohio in Columbus. Initially, we were founded back in 2014 by 7 of the largest companies in the Columbus region. So organizations like Nationwide Insurance, American Electric Power, L Brands, which many of you would know L Brands by Victoria's Secret, Bath and Body Works, Ohio Health, which is the largest hospital chain in the state of Ohio, Huntington National Bank, which is a large regional bank in the area, and then Cardinal Health, which some of you may or may not be familiar with them. They are a Fortune 18 company that focuses in medical and healthcare and logistics. So those 7 companies about 6 years ago came together and said, we spend a lot of money in a couple of areas: big data analytics, machine learning, AI type places, as well as cybersecurity. And it's very difficult for our huge enterprises to innovate quickly. So what they did is they came together through an organization called the Columbus 2020 Partnership, which essentially is a group that helps to strategize and plan the future of industry in the Columbus area. So they came together through the 2020 Partnership and founded the Columbus Collaboratory. So they are our 7 equity owners of originally the Columbus Collaboratory and now Covail. So initially we set out to innovate rapidly for them in the areas of AI, big data, analytics, and then as well as cybersecurity. So what we've done over the last couple of years is we've understood that if we were able to develop services and products and capabilities that had value and quick value to those large industries, those large organizations, that there was some commercial viability to what we were doing as well. So we've taken a lot of our learnings working with those huge enterprises. We've productized and packaged many of them up and started moving them out into the commercial sector. And that's where the name Covail comes from. So this past April, we rebranded from Columbus Collaboratory to Covail, which has got more of a commercial feel to it. So that's kind of the history of where what you're getting ready to hear comes from. A little bit about my background. So I have spent the last 22 years focused specifically in information security. So I got my start as an active duty Marine, doing some really, really interesting things. And the last 4 of my 8 years in the Marines was at the Quantico, which is at the Marine Corps Network Operations and Security Center, where I was the staff NCOIC of the MARCERT, so the Marine Computer Emergency Response Team. Got to see a lot of really, really interesting foreign nation state attack type traffic, responded to those sorts of things. And then ultimately that led me into a career and a path that is focused almost entirely of security, and then also in threat intelligence and understanding, who the threat actors are, which is the philosophy that you're going to see today. And I think a very brief rendition of what usually takes me about an hour to get through. So early on with the Collaboratory and now Covail, we recognized that we were in a very unique position with our 7 founding members, where we had set up an 8-way master services agreement and non-disclosure across those organizations, which was relatively difficult to do, if you can imagine. And having those relationships and with the desire to collaborate and rapidly innovate, we set up an ability to share intelligence with one another, both at a tactical level and at a strategic level. And that information sharing ultimately led to a philosophy that Covail brings to offensive security, as well as helping to build up defensive programs. And that philosophy is very simple. An offensive informed defense will get you in a much better position to defend your networks and your environments from the things that threat actors actually do, instead of having very theoretical discussions about controls and compliances and those sorts of things. So that really is the philosophy that that we bring to everything we do, whether it's our adversarial emulations, which many of you would know as penetration testing, or vulnerability management, or even controls assessments, whether you're a NIST CSF shop or you're an ISO 27001 shop, it doesn't really matter. There is a number of ways that we can apply what we know about threat actors and what we know they actually do to help us ensure that we are prioritizing the right things in our environments that will actually move the needle in reducing risk. So that really is what you're getting ready to see and you're getting ready to hear about in our approach to vulnerability management. So, like I said, I've been around the industry for a little more than 20 years at this point, and I've seen a lot of philosophies come and go. I've seen a lot of capabilities come and go, and a lot of vendors, quite honestly. One of the longest lasting approaches or controls that we see in this space is vulnerability management. It's not sexy, and it's actually really hard to do well. In fact, if you actually do two things well in your network, you're going to be much better off than 80% of the folks of your peers. And those two things are very simple: identity and access management and vulnerability management. In reality, those are the two areas that we continue to be beaten by our adversaries quite regularly. So how does this apply to, and how does an offensive informed defense apply to vulnerability management specifically? Well, what that philosophy means is we understand that there's a playing field, right? That attackers and adversaries operate on. They have certain things that they have to do to be successful. Some of you may be aware of things like the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain, or how MITRE has taken that philosophy and come up with and created the MITRE attack framework, right? Those are both frameworks and approaches to help defenders understand that if you are able to interdict the process or the things that threat actors have to do to be successful, then you can successfully defend against them. That essentially is the playing field. Offensive guys have plays that they call, defenders have plays that we call. So I use this illustration to help try to set up the idea that in vulnerability management, it is just as useful and just as necessary to understand what threat actors are actually exploiting, so that we can figure out how to prioritize what it is that we're going to work on. So we know that most compliance frameworks that exist out there today want us to spend or at least create and build our SLAs and vulnerability management around remediating CVSS 9s and 10s first, right? If you're looking at NIST, if you're looking at any of the federal regulations, if you're really looking at any of those frameworks, to be considered in compliance, you have to be reacting as quickly as possible to any new critical vulnerability that hits your environment. Well, my experience in this industry has shown me that just because those frameworks and those SLAs tell us that the CVSS 9s and 10s are where our priorities should be, we should probably look and start thinking about what threat actors are actually doing and what they're weaponizing. So we did. Based on our data science capabilities at Covail, we did some really deep analysis of the NVD, or the National Vulnerability Database. So for those of you that are not aware, this essentially is a database that houses and collects all of the vulnerabilities that are released for software operating systems, all those sorts of things. So we compared the NVD database to exploit databases, things like Exploit DB or exploits available in Metasploit framework or any of those kind of script kiddie tools, as well as open source and some closed source information about proof of concept code for exploits, and all of that sort of stuff. And some really interesting statistics fell out of that research. So if you look at the NVD database, there's somewhere around a little bit more than 130,000 vulnerabilities that exist in there. If we compare that to things like Exploit DB and known exploits that are in the wild, less than 8% of those vulnerabilities in the NVD database have ever actually been exploited in the wild, right? So this should immediately have you questioning, how do I know in my vulnerability management program that I am focusing on the right 8% and I'm not wasting my time on the wrong 92%. Well, in order to do that, we have to think about and we have to understand threat intelligence from both a tactical view and a very strategic view, right? And that threat intelligence can tell us what threat actors are researching, what they're developing against, what they're weaponizing, and then ultimately what they're exploiting in the wild. So if we go a little bit deeper in this research and in this data, we can look at that 8% of vulnerabilities that have ever actually been exploited. And this is actually a very startling statistic in my mind. Of that 8%, less than 14% of exploited vulnerabilities are actually CVSS 9s and 10s. Okay, so if we've got a situation where our frameworks, our compliances, our regulations are telling us that we have to prioritize patching those 9s and 10s first, we're actually missing the mark and what threat actors are really exploiting and what they're really weaponizing in the wild. So in reality, more than 40% of the vulnerabilities that have been exploited are 7s and below. So some of you may be familiar, if you look over here on the left side of this screen, that CVE 2017-0147. Normally, I would ask if anybody knows what this vulnerability is. Sometimes folks do, sometimes they don't. But if I were to say WannaCry, the ransomware campaign that spread like wildfire across the world back in the spring of 2017, this is one of the vulnerabilities that was leveraged in the WannaCry ransomware attack. Today, right now, that is still the most exploited vulnerability in the entire world, and it has been for a very long time. The reason why is because the CVSS score of that vulnerability does not rise to the level of the SLAs that require us to prioritize remediating that vulnerability. So it stays unremediated, it stays unpatched across networks all the way around the world. So it is still the most exploited vulnerability in the entire world. So that's very problematic, right? So how do we start thinking beyond, this concept of prioritizing and building our metrics around patching CVSS 9s and 10s, right? Because it's a failing approach, in my opinion. We know that threat actors are not targeting those mostly. They're actually targeting the things that most organizations are not spending time or they don't have the time to get to. Well, there's an approach that we have to take. We have to start changing the way that we think about vulnerability management in our organizations. They really can no longer be check boxes, in compliancy. We have to start thinking of them closer to an integrated risk management program as opposed to just a vulnerability scanning and patch all the things or try to patch all the things. Because ultimately most organizations don't have the resources or the time to do that. What they end up ultimately doing is just patching the 9s and 10s, and they're leaving themselves open to a lot of problems. So how do we approach this, right? Well, we came up with the theory or came up with the philosophy that we call real operational risk, okay? So what this means is it is not a theoretical view of risk, it is a very tactical expression or quantification of risk. And we do it through algorithm form. And then ultimately it ends up showing up as a form of prioritization on what to do first and why you should be doing these things first. So historically in vulnerability management programs, we think only about the vulnerability. We think only about really the CVSS score. In some more mature, more advanced vulnerability management programs, you may have a CMDB or an asset database that is part of your risk program, but I can almost guarantee you that it's not complete, that it is very disconnected from your vulnerability management program. So it becomes very difficult to understand the context of a particular vulnerability as it pertains to an asset, to a system, to an application, to your business. Those things are generally very, very disjointed. So in leveraging a tool that we have developed called VMS, which very literally stands for Vulnerability Management Solution, we have developed an algorithm that we call the VTR score, so vulnerability, threat, and rank. And what that VTR score does is it quantifies and it represents a tactical view of risk in your environment. And that risk is made up of these three parts of this Venn diagram. understanding the state of vulnerability in your network. CVSS score is still important, right? All of that stuff comes into account, but it's only a small piece of the discussion. The biggest piece of this discussion, quite honestly, in operational risk is threat intelligence. So we approach this and we achieve this in a number of ways. We want to understand, which articles, which vulnerabilities are trending in the world. We also want to understand from sensors, whether they're from closed source intel sources or from open source intel sources, or they're actual sensors that are out in the world that tell us which vulnerabilities are actually being exploited. That very real-time information is incredibly crucial to us when we want to prioritize what to work on. So the way that we handle this in our VMS platform is if a CVE or a CWE, which most of you may recognize the OWASP top 10, that represents common weaknesses that are enumerated as opposed to common vulnerabilities that are enumerated. So if a CVE or a CWE is actually being exploited in the wild and we're picking it up, and whether it's from threat intel platforms around the world or it's from any of these open or closed source feeds that we're consuming and operationalizing, that CVE will hit that list. It will stay on that list for 30 days. And then if it hits that list again in that 30-day window, it ultimately the clock will start over for that particular CVE. So this is all done algorithmically. Each one of these areas add weight to the prioritization score. And then the third way that we're operationalizing threat intelligence is by operationalizing MITRE ATT&CK in vulnerability management. So that may be a little difficult to understand how we do that. But if you can map vulnerabilities and weaknesses to MITRE techniques, which essentially means a particular type of technique in MITRE ATT&CK, a particular vulnerability would lend itself to a particular technique from MITRE ATT&CK, then we want to be able to show you what your attack surface would look like to a threat actor based on your vulnerability state. We'll show you here in just a few minutes what that actually looks like and how you can use these visualizations to start driving towards mitigations and controls gap analysis, as well as prioritizing, what to work on first. The third piece of this is asset criticality. So I mentioned that historically CMDBs and asset databases are generally very disconnected from vulnerability management. And that makes it difficult to truly understand and quantify the risk that a particular vulnerability presents to your environment. So what we're doing in VMS is we are connecting that information via algorithm. We are doing it by ranking assets from 0 to 10. We are providing context to what those assets mean to your business, to your environment, and to the operation of your network. So for instance, what does that context mean? For instance, if I've got a network of 2 systems, right, and I need to figure out which ones that I'm supposed to work on first, imagine one's responsible for payroll and the second system is just a coffee machine that's connected to the network. How do I know which system that I need to prioritize and work on first? Many would tell you that the payroll system is probably the priority, unless there is context to that coffee machine. So, for example, what if there's a service account on that coffee machine, and that service account exists in an Active Directory group that's nested in another group that's nested in another group that ultimately could lead an attacker to domain admin in your environment? Or what if we're talking about an e-commerce platform that is responsible for 60% of your revenue to your business? So all of this context needs to be understood, and you need to be able to rank and categorize and group assets in such a way that you can make those sorts of decisions. And when we bring this all together algorithmically, we now are essentially quantifying a risk value so that you can actually start making decisions based on that risk. And not only can you make decisions on what to work on first, now we can start talking about real metrics that matter in our vulnerability management program. So if I can quantify risk, then I should be able to calculate if I do so much work in a given period of time that I can actually reduce that risk by a certain amount based on the amount of work that I do. So how do we do this, and how does this actually present itself in the in the VMS system, and what does this actually look like? So let's see here. Let's do this. Share. So hopefully you guys can see the screen that I'm presenting here, which essentially is a quick dashboard of the vulnerability management solution. So I'm going to show you two things here over the next couple of minutes, just to very quickly help you understand what prioritization based on a quantification of risk can do for an organization. So if you recall, there were three areas of data collection and aggregation that were really processing via an algorithm to spit out what we call a VTR score or a prioritization score. So for instance, if I'm looking at my environment, my vulnerability management program, my assets, my vulnerabilities, my risks, my threats, all of that information, what I really need to understand is which system is presenting the most risk to my environment and why. So we can actually start, like I said, we can quantify this information with a number. We can start to understand where this number is coming from. And then we can start to make some decisions. Now, generally, I would drill down into each one of these, and I would show you a little bit about where this data is coming from. But at the end of the day, what truly matters is what am I supposed to do about this, right? So we handle that via recommendations. So essentially, this is how we approach remediation. This is your remediation plan based on your vulnerability state. And because we can now quantify risk with a number, we can actually start to make some decisions based on the amount of work that we can do from patch cycle to patch cycle. And then we can actually develop a remediation plan that says, if you do these things, you will reduce your risk by this much. So let's say, for instance, if I want to reduce my operational risk by 40%, what I need to do is I need to patch these vulnerabilities on these systems with these solutions. That's my remediation plan. If I do those things from time A to time B, I will have reduced my operational risk by 40% to my environment, right? So now, as you can imagine, we are able to start having conversations with leadership that says, my team did this amount of work, here's exactly what we did, and here is the risk reduction that we have gained because we did these things, right? So that's kind of where we are on the remediation plan. Now, I talked a little bit about operationalizing MITRE ATT&CK, and this becomes really, really important if you want to start working your way towards a shop that thinks about MITRE ATT&CK, because it actually addresses and enumerates the things threat actors do. MITRE ATT&CK is generally very difficult to operationalize, to figure out what to do with it. Well, we've actually taken that step, and both from an algorithmic approach and a visualization approach, we can use MITRE ATT&CK and our underlying vulnerability data to start thinking about what our attack surfaces look like to threat actors. So for instance, this is it. I mean, according to MITRE ATT&CK and things that threat actors actually do, by understanding my Nessus scan data, my burp web application scan data, or really any vendor. We're vendor agnostic here. We want to consume all the things. This is what my attack surface would look like to an individual threat actor. I can drill down into all of this. I can understand the vulnerabilities that are mapping to those particular techniques. That's all very easy to do. But where this starts getting interesting is, since we can understand our attack surface as it pertains to MITRE ATT&CK, then we should probably start asking, what does my attack surface look like to specific threat actors or specific groups of threat actors that may be interested in, say, my industry? So I could come in here and I can say, let's say I'm curious about, what is the APT28, which is, Cozy Bear, Fuzzy Bear, the threat actors that essentially are assumed to have hacked the DNC in 2016. What does my attack surface look like to them? Well, essentially, I would enumerate those threat actors, and then I would overlay the techniques that they leverage on my attack surface, and I'm very quickly shown where I have vulnerabilities that map to MITRE ATT&CK, that also map to those threat actors. We can go a step further. We can start to group threat actors together in a number of ways. I can start to think about the industry that I operate in, or I can think about much more timely things like COVID-19. What does my attack surface look like to threat actors that are operating under the umbrella of COVID-19? Well, this is what it would look like based on the vulnerability data of my environment. So this very quickly becomes a form of prioritization in and of itself. So I can prioritize which vulnerabilities I need to remediate if I really want to answer the question of, or I really want to defend against COVID-19 threat actors. But it also becomes more of an ability to do controls gap analysis. So if you know anything about MITRE ATT&CK, not only do they provide you the techniques that these threat actors leverage, they also provide you mitigations and controls that can be useful to defend against those threat actors and the techniques that they leverage. So most organizations, when they think about controls, they think about it from a controls assessment, whether it's NIST CSF, the ISO 27001, whatever framework you're leveraging. So if we were to take NIST, for example, the NIST CSF has somewhere around 800, 900 individual controls in the 5 categories of NIST CSF. Only about 30 of those controls actually matter when it comes to defending technically against the things that threat actors do. It may not even be 30. So 30 technical controls from NIST CSF are actually useful to defend against actual attacker techniques. So we can map those NIST or those ISO or those COBIT or even the CIS top 20 whatever controls to MITRE mitigations and MITRE controls. So the question you should be asking yourself is, what controls do I have in place to defend against these types of techniques? Well, we can actually come in and we can start to deprioritize based on the types of controls that we have in place, right? So we can do this both from a controls assessment approach, or we can do it from a visualization approach. So essentially, if I want to come in here and answer the question that leadership may ask and says, what is the threat to my organization from COVID-19 threat actors? What does the threat look like to me? Well, this essentially is what the threat would look like to me according to my attack surface. And then when I overlay the controls that I know that I'm very good at, I still have some areas in my environment where I need to think about spending money or hiring people or developing processes or developing technology to create the technical controls that are necessary to defend against things like access token manipulation or connection proxies or logon scripts or change default file associations, because these are all techniques that COVID-19 threat actors are leveraging where I have vulnerabilities and I don't appear to actually have a control in place that can handle that type of activity. So there's a lot here, okay? And what I really wanted to get across is in 2020 and then moving forward, if we as an enterprise are still looking or we're still relying on CVSS to prioritize how we're defending against our environment, then we're missing the boat here. It's very interesting to me that the 2017-0147 is still the most exploited vulnerability in the world. But in order for us to be able to make these prioritization decisions, we have to start to think about the bigger picture than just CVSS. So what I spend a lot of my time doing these days is challenging very strongly the assertions that CVSS is the end-all be-all of prioritization. So I think we've got probably another minute or two. I'm going to go ahead and see if I can work my way through here, and let's see if there's any questions that we can get to. Please repeat what you said about why CVE 2017-0147 has not been closed, especially because you stated it is the most commonly exploited vulnerability. Well, the reason why that's it has been patched. Okay, so Microsoft released the patch very early on. The problem is if you deployed a machine and CVE 2017-0147 was vulnerable, or you're running an outdated kind of version, I guess, of SMB, or a number of other reasons. It's just simply not getting remediated in a lot of environments because the CVSS score doesn't rise and it doesn't meet SLAs that require prioritization in those environments. What is a common cause for ransomware, such as WannaCry to company network organization? Well, so it's actually really interesting. So I actually did a talk about a month ago that focused on the 57 vulnerabilities that ransomware, all kinds of different variants are actually targeting. So I'd say about half of ransomware exploits actual vulnerabilities, and the other half of ransomware that's out there uses other methods to infect the systems. The ones that target vulnerabilities, this is exactly why they're successful, because many of the vulnerabilities, there's 57 of them, I think 16 of them are CVSS 9 or 10. The rest of them are 7 and below. This goes right to what we were saying when I started this session off. Most of the vulnerabilities, and they're older too, very few ransomware vulnerabilities that are weaponized today are from 2020 or 2019. Very few of them. Some of them are. Most of them are 2018 and older. We still have a very significant problem in this industry where old vulnerabilities linger. They hang around for a lot of reasons. And unless we understand what threat actors are actually doing, we will never understand the importance of patching those old vulnerabilities, because generally they just get lost in mountains and mountains and lines of data. Okay, so I think I had 30 minutes. I'm at 32 minutes, so we'll go ahead and say thank you, everybody, for listening in. I appreciate the time. If you have any questions, you can always reach me at Vennon, that's V as in Victor, ENNON @covail.com. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.